The following is an Ice on Mars presentation.
In the beginning was the Word, or words, whatever these were. They kept their lights turned off. The exhausted trekkers huddled in the dark cave and faced the peculiar writing. Scrawled with a twig, possibly, dipped in liquid radium or some other radioactive paint, the fluorescent pictographs floated in the black recesses. Ike let them savor the distraction. None of them seemed quite ready to focus on the storm beating against the mountainside outside. With night descending and the trail erased by snow and wind and their yak herders in mutinous flight with most of the gear and food, Ike was relieved to have shelter of any kind. He was still pretending for them that this was part of their trip. In fact, they were off the map. He'd never heard of this hole-in-the-wall hideout, nor seen glow-in-the-dark caveman graffiti. "Runes," gushed a knowing female voice. "Sacred runes left by a wandering monk." The alien calligraphy glowed with soft violet light in the cave's cold bowels. The luminous hieroglyphs reminded Ike of his old dorm wall with its blacklight posters. All he needed was a lash of Hendrix plundering Dylan's anthem, say, and a whiff of plump Hawaiian red Sinsemilla. Anything to vanquish the howl of awful wind. Outside in the cold distance, a wildcat did growl. "There are no runes," said a man. "It's Bonpo." A Brooklyn beat, the accent meant Owen. Ike had 9 clients here, only 2 of them male. They were easy to keep straight. "Bonpo!" one of the women barked at Owen. The coven seemed to take collective delight in savaging Owen and Bernard, the other man. Ike had been spared so far. They treated him as a harmless Himalayan hillbilly. Fine with him. "But the Bonpo were pre-Buddhist," the woman expounded. The women were mostly Buddhist students from a New Age university. These things mattered very much to them. So begins The Descent by Jeff Long. This episode on
dread.dialectic.
Dread.dialectic.
Hey, welcome everyone to, I believe, our 20th episode. This is Michael T. Bradley.
This is Scix Maddox.
And we're going to talk about Jeff Long's The Descent. Now, you're going to have to be careful if you're looking this up because there are just a ton of books and movies named The Descent out there. The Descent, the movie, one of my favorite horror films, directed by, totally blanking on his name. I think he's done a lot of Game of Thrones now. Neil Marshall, yeah. He also did... blanking on it, but the werewolf movie, one of the best werewolf movies ever, an SAS squad versus werewolves, Dog Soldiers, right?
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, and Dog Soldiers, Doomsday, and Descent. He did his, D trilogy. This is The Descent by Jeff Long. It is a 2001 novel. It also involves caves pretty heavily, much like the film The Descent, but it's totally not The Descent... the movie. It also involves kind of a strange subterranean race, but again, not Descent the movie. Very, very different. Something I want to mention before we get into talking about this book in particular is that we're going through a bit of a format change and a bit of a release schedule change, starting with this one. Essentially, from here on out, we're going to be doing... because I think both of us agree that it works much better when we've both read the book, and even if we don't necessarily 100% enjoy it, if we've both read the entire book, I think it presents some better viewpoint exchanges rather than just one person being like, well, I thought this, and the other person just kind of nodding sagely along.
On the microphone.
So we're going to do these as we finish a book that we feel is worth talking about. And that means they won't be coming out as regularly. And we're also going to be doing them when we have both read them.
Right.
So let's see. Basic plot synopsis. It kind of builds and builds and builds and has a lot to it. But I would say, I think the super basic plot synopsis is, through various means... writings and creatures are discovered, and it's realized that there's this hidden mass of caves beneath the entire world, and there's this entire race there, and it appears to be the origin of the stories of hell. It's kind of what's behind hell, that there's this thing beneath us run by this creature who, for want of a better word, is Satan. and all of his minions down there, and sometimes people get pulled down into hell, and
I take issue with their casually equating the leader, so-called leader of the so-called demons with so-called Satan. I think that was a fairly specious connection, but for purposes of discussing the story, we'll go with it.
that's pretty much it. Trigger warnings? God, there's so much going on in this book. I mean, I don't know, like, I think there's some dead babies or whatever, right? I mean, like...
There's a bit of rape. There's some mutilation. I don't know if claustrophobics would have a problem reading the book, but if they're the type that would, the description of the book would be sufficient to let them know.
A fair amount to say about this book. Let's go through and let's talk about the good. What do you say, Scix? Let's talk about the good in this book. Good and the bad, spoiler free.
For me, the first section, before they have this major expedition into the underworld, before that, when people are still like, oh my god, WTF is going on here? There's these things underground. It's weird. That part is way more interesting to me.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, too, is the first part of the book, that's where I was hooked, and that's where I was like, oh, we should do this book. It starts out with this kind of creepy section with a guided tour through the mountains that's gotten off course, and they find this cave with these weird glow-in-the-dark paintings, and then kind of in an almost Hellraiser-y fashion, the different members of the tribe of the tour get, like, you know, they start acting weirder and weirder as they're looking for a way out through these caves, and then the leader of the group is taken hostage by these creepy chained figures that you can't even see in the dark, and that was cool. And then the bodies in the pit that are moving with the next bit, and
that was awesome.
Yeah, just so much stuff in that opening section that I loved, including, I even liked it up to the point where the surface world declares war on hell on live TV.
Yes. and some odd vignettes here and there, even as we get into the second part, they occasionally do an aside, like the woman looking to adopt a child, that little short scene that was attached to nothing else. Those are cool, too. They'd almost be a good short story by themselves.
I liked all of those little bits, for sure. I thought a lot of Jeff's imagery throughout the book was really compelling. I think he described the characters at the different points, you know, the kind of the strata of creatures as you get further down. I thought that was pretty well described.
Yeah, I agree. There's a whole kind of zoo. They don't spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's not just the people like people down there. I mean, there are some that fly, and of course they're eating strange things that don't really exist in the real world. And the descriptions of the monster design, for want of a better phrasing, is really excellent. And the indications of culture are really interesting. And when they get deeper in and they discover like archaeological remnants of an even bigger culture from the past, I think that's interesting.
Yeah. So let's talk about the bad. Without going into spoilers, my biggest frustration with this book was I really loved that first 100 pages or so, but after that, it turns from a horror novel into an adventure novel, and it becomes all about this, like, group setting out on this exploration to discover hell, essentially. And the whole raison d'etre behind this pilgrimage never made any sense to me. Because it's like, we're going to take all these scientists, but then we're also going to take a military contingent, and a military contingent has been down here already setting up packs of, like, rations and shit for us to pick up along the way. And the scientists are eventually, like, it becomes clear that they're viewed as kind of like chaff that they don't really need there. And I can't even remember the real reason behind it, but it's duplicitous, the reason that they're bringing them along. And so it just felt to me like, why were the scientists brought along at all?
And then, of course, the one character who's specifically there looking for Satan, the nun.
Because she's part of, like, a secret fraternity or whatever.
Yeah, it's very Dan Brown, that little secret. Yeah, I mean, the sort of it becomes a forced march through the underground tunnels. They discover things here and there slowly, Every once in a while we pop back up topside, and all the old people who sent the nun on the mission are, like, fighting amongst themselves, accusing each other of being the real Satan and that sort of weird stuff. And they talk about it sort of metaphorically at first, but toward the end they seem to be pretty literally thinking this is Satan.
Will the real Slim Satan please stand up? Yeah, it was just full of all of these kind of adventure story tropes that I hate, like, oh, one guy goes crazy and demands the weapons, and another guy goes crazy and, is like stealing food and yada yada, just all these things where I was like, this is not what I was promised with this book,
Right.
and it takes so long to even meander close to horror again, and we can talk about that once we get to the ugly, where we'll do spoilers and how successful that is. But it takes so long that I was just bored. I didn't find any of the characters interesting enough to keep me focused.
The only remotely interesting character was Ike.
Yeah.
They went through part of the story, that thing that I specifically, personally, hate, and that's when everybody believes that the protagonist is the bad guy because of a misunderstanding or because someone's deliberately framing them. But no one stops to ask enough questions to find out that it's a lie. So
it almost kind of worked with his character simply because he was like so antisocial and uncomfortable around everyone that he just would let it happen.
Yeah.
But it's still, it was just kind of like, meh. But my problem with that was then when the nun, like, becomes friends with him and everything, it's like, well, why did you? If he's not standing up to say this is a lie, like, at all, there seems to be no...
Do you remember how they became friends?
Was it that he offered her an orange?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's it, and that stirred something within her.
Oh, yeah, it stirred, all right. Oh, man, I didn't care for any of the characters, and... there's a lot more that I'll get into that once we get to the ugly, but I don't want to ruin anything. But that is my biggest problem with this book, is that I felt like it should have started at about 100 pages in with the expedition. That's the meat of this story. That's what this book cares about. The opening could have been worked into a much cooler, separate story, but that wasn't the story that he wanted to write. And it was frustrating because Jeff is obviously really good at writing horror, but instead he wrote this cut-rate expedition story.
Yeah.
I almost feel as if he wrote this cut-rate expedition story and somebody was like some editor was like, look, if you're looking for fucking Satan, you have to put in some horror, some terrifying images leading up to that. It really, like, it takes the fang out of Satan, if you will, It makes Satan into an archaeological dig, and it's like...
I thought they were going to go full Doom. I mean, that's where you go if you declare war on Satan.
Like Doom the video game?
Yeah.
Monsters on Mars? Or, oh, you mean like a hell portal opens up?
Right. You've got the military approaching hell. I mean, that's the intersection's got to be combat. Right?
That's, you would think. I mean, it kind of reminded me of, like, there are a lot of, like, movies and stories based on, I want to say, this idea of kind of like, an archaeological dig, and they find, like, a creature that they've never known before, and yada, 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 and maybe you find out that, like, either it's a demon, or it's a dinosaur never known, and then somehow messing with the bones causes it to come back to life, right?
Right.
This very much felt like that exact story, except it never comes back to life. It's just like, let's put that in the Smithsonian.
The end.
I mean, granted, they find something, but the explanation is so dull and so prosaic that I was like, really?
And then nothing comes of what they find.
Well, I mean, there is a sequel, so...
Of course there's a sequel, you can tell, because the very last page is film sequel bait.
The sequel, of course, is called Deeper, which is also the porn parody sequel's title as well. So should we go ahead and talk about The Ugly?
Let's do it.
The thing that I remember about... Because there's this big red herring about who Satan is, because they realize that, like, Satan is a person who, like... summers in hell, I guess, and
right.
and like somehow everybody is following him,
He
and
moves among us.
And I had totally pegged the red herring long before it becomes like an obvious red herring. And so there's a scene where the red herring is killed, and I was like, oh, it's not going to work, and the red herring's going to spear him or something. And then they just both die, or the kid dies or whatever. And I was like, oh, shit, what? And then when it's revealed who Satan was, I was like, I don't think I remember this character.
Yeah, that was me as well. And actually, I had completely forgotten about that whole transfer of personality thing with the dissected cadaver.
The what?
Remember they were slicing up the cadaver of the young girl Heuvelt, and as the slicer got to the hypothalamus, she sent out an electric charge into the doctor's brain and took over his mind. Do you not remember that?
No, not at all. Was that Satan?
No, I think that was just indicating that Heuvelt can body jump, which is set up for this dying guy might not be really dead. Dun 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 dun.
It just, like, at the end, it's basically like, oh, Satan's just like this guy, and sometimes he escapes and is on the earth, but, like, everybody else who lives underground looks all weird and fucked up, and he just is a guy. And it's like,
yeah,
wait.
Being underground mutates them in some fashion. Causes them to grow horns, in fact.
Right, but for him, it doesn't do anything, and he's able to pose as a... I mean, it seemed like there for a bit, I was like, after the red herring is taken out, I was like, shit, is Ike Satan? Because at least he has the Calca traits or whatever, right? It seemed like, where is this going? And then it's like, oh no, who's that guy? And I'm like, I don't remember that guy. Sorry, Jeff.
I think he was one of the Dan Brown people upstairs.
Yeah, I think they mentioned that he's one of them. But yeah, I have no idea. It just, by that point, I didn't care, and I was so tired of it, and it becomes like a shitty action movie for the climax, and this book really frustrated me because I really loved it. I burned through the first 100 pages or so, and it's maybe 600 pages long. Then I just had to skim and skip like crazy through the expedition stuff just because I'm like, I just want to see Satan, you know? I just want to see a firefight with Satan. Like, that's going to be awesome, and sadly it just wasn't.
Nope, he got shot by a mad sniper with a specially developed sci-fi incendiary sunburst round.
Which, speaking of the sci-fi stuff, that's another thing that really annoyed me with this book. There was this fucking one random time paradox subplot thrown in there, and it just felt like, Jesus, Jeff, are you just throwing in every fucking genre just in case? Like, maybe I'll change my mind and make this a time paradox story later. Do you remember that, where the expedition gets the distress call?
Oh, yes, from the future.
Yeah, it sounds like one of their own, and then eventually that guy leads a small party. They, split up because the military has just said, fuck you guys, we don't need you, to the scientists. And it's like, why were they there in the first place? And so the scientists split into two groups, and that guy leads a small group in what seems to be the safer route. And of course everybody dies, and he's the last one left alive, and he sends this distress call to himself in the past. And it's like, instead of being chilling, it was like, what? Where did that come from? There's nothing else in this book that seems to imply like a time paradox would fit.
The other thing they did was the radio messages from down below would take days to reach topside, which is... that's got to be a time thing, because that makes no sense whatsoever. It either makes it out or it doesn't. It's not going to take days. Not carrier pigeon.
Okay. Yeah, so...
but
okay.
It makes no sense. It does not fit the rest of any of the mythos or the rules of the universe.
Like I say, it just felt like Jeff was like, shit, let's throw another genre on the pile, because why not?
It's very Journey to the Center of the Earth, if we're going for sci-fi genres.
Sure, or the Morlocks in Time Machine, right? Maybe that was what it was. It was like, oh, I'm writing a time machine riff. I might as well throw in at least one small time paradox.
I kind of want to spoil the very last page. Okay, so Thomas, a.k.a. Satan, has been shot by this thing that's, lit him up from the inside, from top to tail. His brainstem is severed, and he's dying. Later, someone comes upon the site and sees everybody's dead. Just everybody's dead, but his corpse looks a bit fresher. And then, suddenly, he opens his eyes! Ah!
Was that the last page? The thing that I remember at the end was Ike and the nun hug.
I suppose whichever order they came in, it was the screamer was intended as the final image, I think.
I just remember that because I was like, what a weird, like, it reminds me of Bed of Roses, the shitty film we did on, that I did with Ford, where it's like, it ends with them hugging, and it's like, really, a hug? Okay. And that hug goes on for like a minute.
I will say this, they mostly avoided the useless romantic trope that could have gone in there very easily. She was sort of slightly obsessed with Ike, but it never seemed romantic or erotic from any direction.
I actually thought it seemed too much romantic.
Really?
Their interaction, yeah.
I
But
didn't get
maybe
that.
that was just because I hated everything about the goddamn expedition. Yeah, it's so frustrating, because I really thought this book was going to be kind of more of a, like a Hellraiser meets Doom sort of book, and instead it's like... God, I don't know. I can't even imagine what to compare it to. It feels like some sort of like shitty Die Hard ripoff that happens to throw hell and time travel into it.
Yeah.
Oh, well. So, you can probably guess, it goes without saying, I would not recommend this to someone.
I would recommend it if I could take part of it and recommend the part.
Sure, yeah. Definitely some really good bits in here. And who knows, maybe the sequel saves it somehow. Maybe the sequel is much more focused and a much better story. I don't know. I mean, I'm curious about it. A lot of books that we've been doing have sequels or part of a series, and it's like, I wonder if it gets better or different at least. Yeah, if you've got comments, questions, or things you'd like us to read, feel free to get in touch with us, dread.dialectic@gmail.com. Otherwise, please feel free to comment, like and subscribe, all that sort of stuff. For now, this is Michael T. Bradley.
And this is Scix Medics.
And we are